When Karoline Leavitt entered the chamber that day, many were already preparing themselves for the kind of sharp, fiery rhetoric that usually accompanies high-stakes political showdowns. Her reputation as a tough spokesperson had always preceded her. In the eyes of colleagues, rivals, and journalists alike, she was expected to deliver statements with precision and intensity, often pushing back hard against those who challenged her. Yet, as the microphones were switched on and the cameras began recording, what unfolded was something entirely different from what both her supporters and critics had anticipated. Instead of launching into a combative defense or lashing out at Jasmine Crockett, Karoline chose to disarm the tension with her tone. Observers noted immediately that her posture, her cadence, and her word choice all reflected a deliberate effort to step away from the usual adversarial approach. Rather than acting as though the $80 million case was a battlefield, she framed her appeal in a way that signaled understanding and seriousness. She didn't posture as though she were speaking only to secure her own political footing. Instead, her language suggested she was thinking about the broader implications, hinting at the way this case had already drawn public focus away from pressing issues that mattered to everyday Americans. The decision to use restraint was not only unusual for the moment, it was calculated. Some insiders close to her had quietly speculated beforehand that such a strategy might carry more weight than a heated confrontation. After all, audiences whether inside Congress or across the country are often quick to tune out political shouting matches. But when someone known for being combative chooses instead to show humility and measured calm, people tend to pay closer attention. That was the effect Karoline achieved as she addressed Jasmine Crockett directly. She said that the lawsuit had grown larger than either of them as individuals, that the constant headlines risked turning an important matter into nothing more than partisan theater. She acknowledged, almost with a note of vulnerability, that the attention surrounding the case had become a distraction. This was not the kind of rhetoric many expected from her. It lacked the sharp edges. It wasn't about scoring points or drawing applause. It was about deliberately changing the atmosphere in the room. By speaking in this tone, Karoline set a stage where Crockett's response would hold even greater weight. The decision to restrain herself meant that the usual back-and-forth theatrics of congressional hearings were muted. Instead, there was silence, pauses, and the unmistakable sense that both sides were being watched for more than just their ability to outshout the other. In politics, tone often speaks louder than substance, because it reveals intent. And in this moment, Karoline's intent appeared to be not escalation, but appeal. The choice mattered because it forced everyone in the chamber to listen differently. Reporters scribbled notes not about fiery exchanges, but about an unexpected shift in character. Lawmakers sitting on the sidelines found themselves leaning forward, waiting to see how Crockett would respond to an appeal rather than an attack. Even viewers following the hearing from afar later admitted that what struck them most was not what Karoline said, but how she said it. Her calm, measured delivery also subtly placed the responsibility on Crockett to set the tone of what followed. If Karoline had opened with aggression, Crockett's firm rebuttal might have seemed like a standard counterpunch. But because Karoline spoke without heat, Crockett's eventual reply felt even more decisive, standing on principle rather than politics. This is why the moment carried such resonance. Karoline's restraint had cleared the air of noise, leaving space for words to land more heavily. For Karoline herself, the move revealed a side of her political persona that many had not often seen. Those who had long dismissed her as merely combative were reminded that tone can be a powerful tool in its own right. By stepping back from drama and leaning into composure, she created an atmosphere where accountability, seriousness, and principle could take center stage. And though her appeal was ultimately rejected, the way she delivered it became a critical part of the story, underscoring just how powerful restraint can be in moments of high pressure. When Jasmine Crockett leaned toward her microphone and delivered her reply, it became immediately clear that she was not framing the $80 million lawsuit as a matter of dollars and cents. Her words redirected the entire narrative away from the financial figure that had dominated headlines and straight toward a theme that resonated far more deeply. Accountability, she explained, in calm but unwavering language. That dropping the case would send the wrong message, one that implied political or personal power could erase consequences. It wasn't about punishing someone, she stressed, but about preserving trust in the system. In that moment, she turned a legal and political clash into something larger, a test of whether accountability truly applied equally to everyone. Her statement carried a weight that shifted the tone in the room. It wasn't emotional outburst or dramatic grandstanding. Instead, it was principle-driven reasoning. By saying, "This isn't about money," she neutralized the idea that her motivation was financial gain or political leverage. Too many listening, the insistence that accountability mattered more than the settlement figure reminded them of why oversight, investigations, and legal proceedings exist in the first place. They aren't supposed to serve as bargaining chips. They're meant to safeguard fairness. Karoline Leavitt had opened the door with her measured tone, hoping to appeal for restraint. Crockett, however, refused to walk through that door. Instead, She reminded everyone that leadership requires holding the line, even when there are easier paths. Had she chosen to step away from the lawsuit, the headlines might have quieted, the political circus might have moved on, and both women could have avoided further scrutiny. But Crockett recognized that such a move would have looked, to many Americans, like surrendering accountability in exchange for convenience. Her refusal highlighted a tension at the heart of governance, whether officials should prioritize political peace or the principle of responsibility. Asterisk. This point was not lost on those sitting in the chamber. Staffers glanced around the room as if to silently measure the reactions of colleagues. Some lawmakers nodded slightly, not necessarily in agreement with Crockett's politics, but in recognition of the clarity of her stance. Even reporters scribbling down her words knew they had captured a quote that would define the coverage for the day. Accountability had become the headline, not the money. Asterisk. The shift also had implications beyond that single hearing. For him, an observer following the exchange closely, it became a reminder of how public officials communicate values. He recognized that accountability is often the word that distinguishes leadership from mere politics. When politicians emphasize numbers, deals, or settlements, it can feel transactional. But when they stand firmly on accountability, they invite the public to consider not just the outcome, but the precedent being set. Crockett's insistence that she could not, and would not, drop the case reinforced the idea that the integrity of institutions relies on holding people responsible, regardless of stature. Asterisk. Her words also carried resonance outside the walls of Congress. Viewers watching the replay later that evening understood the broader message, that power should not buy immunity, and that responsibility does not vanish because a settlement is possible. The fact that Crockett's stance was expressed calmly, without the sharp edges of political theater, gave it additional strength. People often expect grandstanding from politicians, but when accountability is expressed plainly, it cuts through skepticism. Asterisk for Karoline. Hearing that response had its own significance. By appealing for resolution and asking Crockett to step back, she had hoped to diffuse the intensity of the lawsuit. But Crockett's reply reframed her request as something impossible to grant without undermining accountability itself. In effect, Karoline's appeal set up Crockett's moment of clarity. One side sought peace, while the other insisted on principle. Together, the exchange illustrated a dynamic scene, often in politics, compromise colliding with accountability, and in this case, accountability was the point that stuck. Asterisk. That day, Crockett's insistence on accountability echoed through Congress not because it was shouted, but because it was said with conviction. By making it clear that this case was not about an $80 million price tag, but about whether standards of responsibility could be upheld, she captured attention in a way that went beyond partisanship. For him, and for many who followed the story closely, the moment served as a striking example of how accountability, when voiced with clarity, can become more powerful than any financial figure attached to a headline. Asterisk. When Jasmine Crockett delivered her response, the chamber did not erupt in the usual noise that follows a heated exchange. Instead, something unusual happened. Members of Congress, aides, and journalists all seemed to pause at the same time, realizing the weight of what had just been said. The moment was powerful not because voices were raised, but because one voice, steady and firm, carried clarity that was impossible to ignore. This silence wasn't empty. It was full of recognition that accountability had just been placed above politics, and that the tone of the hearing had shifted entirely. Asterisk. The absence of drama made the moment stand out even more. Typically, congressional hearings are filled with interruptions, rebuttals, and grandstanding meant for television clips. But here, Crockett's.com words held the floor. She didn't lecture, she didn't mock, and she didn't fall into the trap of trying to win applause. Instead, her statement was stripped down to principle. That's why the chamber stilled, because people understood that something had been said which didn't need embellishment. It was a reminder that sometimes, the most stunning responses are not the loudest, but the most unwavering. Asterisk. Karoline Leavitt's earlier tone of restraint made this silence possible. By not escalating into fiery rhetoric, she had created space where Crockett's reply could resonate without being drowned out by noise. In many ways, Karoline's decision to speak carefully set the stage for the very moment that followed. The absence of theatrics from both sides allowed the weight of Crockett's words to be felt all the more strongly. The surprise was not just in what was said, but in how it was delivered. Asterisk for him. Watching closely, the silence after Crockett's reply told a bigger story than the words themselves. It was the kind of pause that reveals when people are genuinely processing what they've heard. In politics, audiences often clap or cheer out of habit, reacting to style more than substance. But here, the lack of immediate reaction suggested that listeners were weighing the implications in real time. He noticed how unusual that was in a setting so often dominated by noise. Silence in Congress is rare, and when it happens, it usually signals that something meaningful has cut through the usual chatter. Asterisk. Reporters picked up on this dynamic quickly. Instead of rushing to describe conflict or heated exchanges, their notes captured the quiet that followed. The room froze. One later wrote, "It wasn't the kind of silence that comes from disinterested, it was the silence that comes from impact." That framing mattered, because it showed how Crockett's.com firmness had left a stronger impression than any dramatic outburst could have. It also demonstrated how tone and delivery can alter the way history remembers an exchange. Asterisk. The reaction inside the chamber also revealed something about human nature. People are conditioned to expect noise in political conflict, but when they are instead met with calm certainty, it unsettles expectations. That unsettling quality is what stuns. Crockett's response wasn't shocking because it was aggressive. It was shocking because it was immovable. She had essentially told Karoline and everyone listening that principles are not negotiable. Even when pressured in a public forum, the silence that followed proved that the message had landed. Karoline herself had to sit with that silence. Having made her appeal for stepping back from the lawsuit, she had hoped for dialogue, maybe even negotiation. Instead, she was met with a reply that closed the door firmly but respectfully. That response carried an authority that no counter-argument could easily shake. The stillness that followed was not just the absence of noise. It was the presence of finality. Karoline's appeal had been heard, considered and rejected not with anger, but with conviction. For him, reflecting on the exchange later, the moment underscored how sometimes the most influential parts of politics aren't the arguments that echo with volume, but the ones that echo with silence. Crockett's.com refusal, paired with the chamber's stunned stillness, showed that power doesn't always need to shout to be felt. It can be quiet, it can be measured, and still it can leave a room into Congress completely stunned. The exchange between Karoline Leavitt and Jasmine Crockett did not remain confined to the walls of the hearing room. Within hours, clips were circulating online. Headlines were filling digital news feeds, and television anchors were repeating Crockett's words with emphasis. What had started as a congressional moment quickly spilled into a national conversation. People weren't debating whether Karoline's request had been reasonable or whether the $80 million figure was fair. Instead, the focus had shifted entirely to what Crockett had said about accountability, and the ripple effect was immediate. For him, watching the coverage unfold, the speed with which the story spread was telling. It showed that the public was hungry for discussions rooted in principle rather than spectacle. He noticed how commentators on both sides of the aisle were forced to address the substance of Crockett's reply, rather than dismiss it as partisan theater. Even those who disagreed with her politics had to acknowledge the clarity of her stance. Accountability had become the word of the day, dominating the conversation far more than the financial stakes of the lawsuit ever had. In living rooms, offices, and online forums, people began weighing in. Some applauded Crockett for holding firm, saying it was refreshing to see a lawmaker emphasize responsibility instead of compromise. Others argued that Karoline's plea for de-escalation had merit, that political energy should be spent on governing rather than courtroom battles. But regardless of which side they took, nearly everyone agreed on one thing. Crockett's reply had been stunning, not because it was dramatic, but because it was grounded in principle. The ripple effect also reached Congress itself. Lawmakers who had been present in the chamber were asked for their thoughts by reporters, and many admitted that the silence following Crockett's words had struck them. Some quietly suggested that her stance might force others to rethink how they approached their own high-profile disputes. After all, it was rare to see a politician reject an opportunity for quick resolution in favor of taking the longer, harder road of accountability. That example carried weight, especially in a political climate where compromise is often seen as the easiest way out. The media narrative amplified this perception. Headlines were written not about conflict, but about conviction. Crockett rejects $80 million appeal, cites accountability over politics. One read, another declared, Congress stunned by calm refusal. These headlines framed the exchange as more than just another partisan fight. They positioned it as a test of integrity. For him, this shift in framing was significant. He recognized that while political battles often dominate news cycles for their noise, this story dominated for its clarity. Public reaction added another layer to the ripple effect. Ordinary citizens took to social media to share their thoughts, many repeating Crockett's line about accountability. Some called it a defining moment, a rare instance where political discourse rose above strategy and touched on principle. Others used it as a rallying cry, suggesting that the public should demand similar accountability from leaders across the board. The reach of the moment extended far beyond those who had been watching the hearing live. For Karoline, the ripple effect was more complicated. While her tone of restraint had earned some praise, it was ultimately overshadowed by Crockett's reply. The national conversation was not about Karoline's appeal, but about Crockett's refusal. That didn't erase the significance of Karoline's approach. It had set the stage, but in the broader narrative, it was Crockett's words that defined the moment. Karoline had to face the reality that even when speaking carefully, one can still be outshined when the response carries unshakable conviction. For him, this outcome reinforced an important observation. That political impact often lies not in the spectacle of the moment, but in the principles that survive after the noise fades. The ripple effect of Crockett's words proved that accountability resonates more deeply than numbers, headlines, or strategies. It became a national talking point not because it was dramatic, but because it was clear, firm, and rooted in responsibility. That ripple continued long after the hearing ended, shaping conversations in Congress, in the media, and across the country. As the dust settled on the exchange between Karoline Leavitt and Jasmine Crockett, it became clear that this was not just another moment in the endless cycle of congressional hearings. It was something more enduring, a conversation that challenged the way politics is often conducted and reminded the public of what can happen when clarity and conviction meet on a national stage. Karoline's approach, though unexpected, set an important tone. By speaking with restraint rather than aggression, she demonstrated that there is value in stepping back from the usual theatrics of political confrontation. For a figure often associated with sharp pushback, this choice showed another side of leadership, one that recognizes when humility can speak louder than force. Her appeal, while unsuccessful, provided an opening for dialogue that might otherwise have been buried under noise. That in itself was noteworthy. But it was Jasmine Crockett's reply that defined the moment. By refusing to reduce the case to an $80 million figure, and instead insisting that accountability must take precedence, she shifted the entire narrative. Her words were not just a rejection of Karoline's request, they were a declaration that principle cannot be bargained away, even when the stakes are high. In doing so, she reminded both her colleagues and the public that accountability is not optional in leadership. It is foundational. The silence that followed her response underscored just how powerful a calm and steady statement can be. In a place where arguments often spill into shouting and interruptions, the absence of noise was its own kind of testimony. It revealed that Crockett's words had cut through the usual partisanship and touched on something more universal: the need for trust, fairness, and responsibility in public life. For him, observing closely, the ripple effect that followed was as important as the exchange itself. He saw how the story quickly leaped from the walls of Congress into the national spotlight, shaping conversations not just among politicians and journalists, but among everyday people. The moment became more than just a political clash, it became a lens through which Americans debated what they expect from their leaders. Some sided with Karoline, seeing merit in compromise and closure, while others echoed Crockett's stance that accountability cannot be abandoned. But I'll recognize that something significant had been said. In the end, this episode was less about who won or lost and more about the kind of leadership each woman represented. Karoline embodied the power of restraint, showing that tone can alter the course of a debate. Crockett embodied the power of principle, proving that accountability can outshine even the largest financial figure. Together, their exchange reminded Congress and the country that moments of clarity still exist in politics, moments that transcend party lines and leave a lasting imprint. And so, what began as a hearing about an $80 million case became something larger. A story about the enduring weight of accountability, the impact of tone, and the rare but unforgettable moments when politics pauses to reflect on principle. It was a reminder that sometimes, in the midst of all the noise, the most powerful words are the ones that leave a room stunned into silence.